What's up, everyone? Welcome into another edition of Bills Talk Live with Matt Parrino and Ryan Talbot. And we are live here at about 1:05 a.m. We're taping this. We're live on Facebook. But if you might be listening to this now live on Facebook, you may be listening to it on one of the podcast networks or podcast applications that you subscribe to. Bills Talk with Matt Parrino. We got to get Ryan's name on there. I'm working on it. That is available on Apple, Google now, Stitcher, Spotify, and Acast. So definitely subscribe, rate, and review if you're hearing us there. This is a big day for the Buffalo Bills. Because yesterday was a day filled with angst and waiting. Without a first-round pick, everybody was playing Stephon Diggs highlights all day long. And then you get to today and all the potential options. And I think it was Adam Schefter, that tweeted out earlier this afternoon that he's talked to some NFL front office folks that told him this is going to be the deepest second round in a long time. And then, it starts to play out. You see a couple offensive weapons go, and you get to, I'd say in the 40s, and you start to see the amount of talent that's still on the board. I mean, what are you thinking there, Ryan, when you're, some of the names that haven't gone yet? And even when you landed 54 and some of the decisions that Brandon Beane had to make.
It's interesting. Last night after the first round, I put together a second round mock draft from 33 to 54. And as I was doing that, I was looking at every team's needs and all that. And by the time I got to Buffalo's pick, I said, wow, there is so much talent on the board right now. And obviously I knew every pick that I went, that went before that wasn't necessarily going to go in that order or be off the board. I was blown away last night when I was putting it together with the amount of talent that I knew was going to be there for Buffalo in round two. And I think it felt even better for them in the actual draft, where you're getting closer and closer to that pick. And as you get into the mid 40s and the high 40s, you're saying, I hope Brendan Beane doesn't try to trade up, because someone's going to fall directly into his lap, just like last year. Ed Oliver fell into his lap, number 9, but this is completely different. This is pick 54, and you grab a player who, in the very beginning of the draft process, people were scoffing when you suggested AJ Epenesa could fall to the Bills at number 22. So to get him at 54 is just a tremendous, tremendous value.
And sorry, looking down here on the live stream, trying to share it out so people know that we are live, so you can watch it live. Follow us on all of our social media platforms. Just search Buffalo Bills on NYUp. That's usually a good way to find us. But in terms of AJ Epenesa, a couple picks before, I thought that, the big target, even with Epenesa still on the board, because I think, like you mentioned, I never really thought it would come to that point where he would last to 54. I think in Dane Brugler from The Athletic, his latest mock draft had him going at 36. So I thought somewhere in the 40s, somebody would maybe reach a little bit. Houston maybe going for a pass rusher. And it's funny, we saw some other pass rushers go ahead of him in that 40 to 50 range. One of them, Daryl Taylor, which, he's kind of Seattle traded up to get him. He's a high upside guy that I think people are still, wondering what his fit's going to be at this level. But obviously Seattle saw enough in him to make that move as Ryan's cat attacks him, looking like a miniature Zack Moss over there.
Yeah.
So I think, you look at this pick, and I mentioned Trevon Diggs, the cornerback, goes a couple picks before the Bills, and he's somebody that I really had tabbed. And then as we're getting to that pick and it's made, you're sitting there like, okay, AJ Epenesa is going to be there. This is a guy that I know from conversations I've had dating back to the combine, that while I don't think they were probably expecting him to be in play at 54, he was pretty highly ranked on on their board internally. I mean, Brandon even said it tonight that they had a pretty high grade on him. So some of the things that they like about him. Let's move to that part of it. And if you have any questions on the live stream here, please feel free to mention them, whatever you'd like us to talk about. But I think I want to get into what AJ Epenesa brings and why they're so excited about it, because one of the things you find, obviously the combine results weren't as good as you probably want. The 40 time was really slow. Only one guy in the top 40 defensive ends ran a slower 40 time. But Brandon even said, I'm not looking for a track star. I'm looking for a football player. And he needs a guy that's going to do his 1/11th. And in this case, his 1/4 or his quarter on that defensive line and help rush as a unit and be a good team player. And you can hear it from everything that he was talking about today on his press video conference. I want to come in, I want to compete. Obviously has a chip on his shoulder because, he did have to watch 53 other guys go before him, but he's, everything out of his mouth was team first mindset. And that just fits in. I mean, these are the culture kind of pieces that Brandon and Sean like to keep kind of inserting on this roster.
The first thing that stuck out to me about Epenesa, even early in the process, was the height, was the weight, was the wingspan. The Bills look for certain measurables in all three of those areas when you're talking about edge rushers, or even if you go back to the defensive ends that McDermott had with the Carolina Panthers, and they're all bigger guys, closer to that 270, 280 weight, maybe in the 260s. And Epenesa checked all those boxes, and tremendous wingspan. It doesn't have the track speed, but technique. That's his game. That's how he wins. And I just think that he checks so many boxes for the Bills that, it was probably an easy decision for the team. The cat knocks up my earbud. When they got to pick number 54. So I just think that everything kind of added up and worked in Buffalo's favor there. Now, I would have loved to have seen what would have happened if Diggs had been on the board as well at that point, because then I think it would have been a really interesting conversation and a decision for this team, because I still think cornerback's a sneaky need, but I do think edge rusher probably was a little bit higher on their draft board in terms of a need. But yeah, in terms of what Sean McDermott likes from a defensive end, Epenesa really does check all those boxes.
Yeah, it's interesting. Brandon also added in his press conference when he was asked about, need versus best player on the board in these early rounds. And he said, listen, even with the work that I did in free agency and after drafting Epenesa, if tomorrow a guy is standing out that's an edge rusher that can get after the quarterback, I'll draft 3 more of them, because you can't have enough of those kind of guys. And I think Epenesa is a guy that is going to come in here and work hard, which that's the first thing that you want to see in a guy. Going back to the combine, having the conversations with him, you could tell the work ethic kind of popped pretty early for them, and how he handled all this process. I mean, for a guy to have to sit there and watch in January mock drafts where he's going middle of the first round, mid to late first round, to all the way now where he has to, pretty much swallow his pride a little bit and go late in the second round. His attitude, I think, speaks to why they're so excited to have him in the room. And I think that, I wrote it in my 7 thoughts on a grade that we posted to the website, nyupinsyracuse.com. You can head over there and read that now. This could mean trouble for Trent Murphy, because obviously the Bills can save $8 million by cutting him and moving on. I don't know if there's necessarily anything else pressing to spend that capital on, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind if there's a move to be made, because I don't think at any point Beane's going to sit on his hands and say my work here is done and this roster is where I want it to be.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think they're going to, who knows if there's going to be an NFL training camp, but I think at worst, you bring him into training camp, you see what he has, you make sure you stay healthy at that position. And if you are healthy, getting closer to the regular season, well, then maybe you try, you part ways with him, however that may be. I don't know if there'd be much of a trade market for him. Brendan Beane mentioned he's not looking to trade him. I'm not sure the market would be there for that, but one way or another, he is on the hot seat all of a sudden. And I like that you said earlier that Beane said that if there's another defensive end or an edge rusher there that we like and he's the highest player, we're going to take them. We saw that already in this draft. We saw the Raiders go back-to-back wide receiver, literally back-to-back with 2 straight picks. We've seen the Patriots take 2 tight ends in this draft already. It's just following your draft board. If a Bradley and I is high on their draft board here and he's there on day 3, which he's there right now, maybe you go that route, just because you can never have enough pass rushers, especially when you have a Sam Darnold and a Tua, and to a lesser extent a Jarrett Stidham. because I still think they're going to do something there. Maybe
Oh yeah.
I'll be wrong, and they will really roll out with him and Hoyer and some rookie that they pick up tomorrow. But I still think that you have a Cam Newton that's in play or a Jameis Winston somehow, some way. So yeah, being able to get after the passer is so important. So I wouldn't mind if the Bills did end up taking another edge rusher at some point in this draft.
Yeah, I see. If you have a comment, leave it in or question, leave it in the below here, and we'll definitely try to get to it. We'll be here for another 20 minutes or so to talk. It's day 2 of the draft, but I'm looking here, and there was a lot of excitement around the idea of a running back in round 2. There was a couple. If you look at the top 5, I think any one of them landing with the Bills would have really excited the fan base. Not that Zack Moss hasn't, and I think we'll get to him in a moment. But J.K. Dobbins was the one guy that was left on the board. It was Cam Akers that went before pick 54, which I think a lot of people thought, he might be a trade up option in the 3rd round. I even thought that, even with the hype around his name. But we did see 4 running backs go off the board before the Bills selected at 54. J.K. Dobbins was still at the on the board. Let me ask you, comparing to what they ended up getting in addition to Epenesa, waiting till the 3rd round to get Moss, the difference between a Moss and a Dobbins, and I think the value of adding a guy like Epenesa outweighs what I think the upside with a Dobbins, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. I did have Dobbins higher than Moss on my little running back rankings, but it really wasn't significantly higher, believe it or not. I had Moss in a tier that was actually above AJ Dillon, another guy that went before Moss. And I really liked his game. I liked his fit for this team. So to be able to get him in the 3rd round and then add an Epineza in round 2, that's just tremendous value for this regime, for this front office and for this team. Now, did the Bills have to sweat it out a little bit to get Moss? Absolutely. Luckily for them, there weren't really many teams from 80 on that needed a running back, but you just never know in this in the NFL who's going to do what. So they made it interesting. I think that he was probably the last one that they would consider there in the 3rd round. Maybe they liked Evans enough out of Appalachian State to go that route if Moss had been taken, but it ended up working out for the Bills.
Yeah, so moving to the 3rd round pick, Zak Moss, you mentioned you had him ranked pretty high, considerable to some of the top guys in the class, and it's I didn't do a lot of due diligence on him because I really was convinced that the Bills would maybe take a day 3 flyer on a running back as opposed to addressing it here. But what this tells me by the Bills going out and getting Moss in the 3rd round is that they feel their roster is at a place where they're happy with. It tells me that they're confident in the cornerback group that they've assembled, because Cameron Dantzler was on the board, and he ended up going a few picks later. And that was a guy that, we talked to several, draft experts over the last couple of weeks, Ryan Wilson from CBS Sports, but it was actually Chris Trapasso from CBS and John Ledgard, which we talked to on Wednesday night, who both kind of sang the praises of Cameron Dantzler and his potential fit in the zone scheme with Sean McDermott. I thought that could have been a nice option there and go running back later in the draft. But I think that also speaks to me that, hey, okay, we think that we're maybe one piece away in this running backs room from having a really potent 1-2 punch. And Brandon actually said that Zack Moss was higher on his board than the spot that they got him at. So what was happening was he was starting to make some calls, and the problem was to trade up to get Moss. That's how bad they wanted him. The problem was the teams in front of him didn't want to move down. They didn't want to trade down and get out of their picks. So he was kind of nervous a little bit. He said the pick was stressful. And so to get that kind of guy with the proven track record of this regime now in 3 drafts, obviously the first one with just Sean McDermott, but some of the gems that came out of that one, you have to be really excited if you're a Bills fan that Bean got a guy that he was that high on.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it sounds like he had maybe a mid 3rd round or a high 3rd round grade on him, maybe even a late 2nd. I'm not sure. I don't know if we'll ever know that. But it goes back to the best player available philosophy. Dantzler would have been a great addition to this team, but I'm assuming he had Moss a little bit higher. He probably sees both as being positions that could have been addressed in this draft. The one thing I'll say is there are still some intriguing cornerback options out there. Bryce Hall, a guy that I thought could have gone on night 2 of the draft, but that ankle injury might be pushing him down. Troy Pride Jr. out of Notre Dame, another guy that fits that zone defense. So there's two guys right there that could be potential targets on day 3 for the Bills, and there's others as well, but it might just speak more so to the depth and to the tiers of how they had these players, because like I said, Moss was up there among the better running backs in this class.
We will talk a little bit about where we think the direction's going to go in the 4th and 5th round, and maybe some targets, because Ryan put out a great piece today on guys that he likes in each round. But on Moss as a complementary piece, so this fits more the mold of a downhill runner in between the tackles. It's interesting. I thought that the descriptions of his play style and kind of what he brings to the table differed a little bit between Moss himself and Brandon Beane, where Brandon kind of called him that one cut, in between the tackles, physical presence, where I almost get the sense that Moss has a little bit higher expectations of himself and what he can do with the football. And I mean, you look at the production, even though it was at Utah, Pac-12 Offensive Player of the Year in the Pac-12, which maybe is not as strong as a conference as some of these other big time conferences, but the production, 1,400 yards, 15 touchdowns on the ground, can catch the ball a little bit, and that physical, he landed in a really good spot to have the kind of style that he runs with because of the Bills' proven ability now with this regime. It's funny, this story came out about the Pagulas this past week, and about maybe some of the toxic environment that's going on within PSE. The Athletic put out that story. It was very eye-opening, but the juxtaposition of that is what they've done to build not only the culture with Brandon and Sean, but the performance improvements, upgrades, the weight room, the fitness areas, the rehab facilities. They really have figured it out on how to keep guys healthy. You look at all the guys that were injured last year, that played through injuries, had surgeries after the season. Kevin Johnson getting through a full season for the first time in a couple years. They're Trent Murphy. He started almost every game for the last 2 seasons, coming off of a very serious injury. So I think that they have faith that they can keep him healthy. And not only that, Brandon Beane puts names in red on his draft board if there's medical concerns. Usually drops him down a half a round grade or a round completely. And he said that Zack Moss was not red on his board.
Yeah, and you have to wonder if maybe the Bills did a thorough medical check on him at the combine, because they didn't meet with him there. They were one of, I think, 12 teams that met with him. They did the Zoom conference call. Maybe they had medicals kind of sent over. So I'm sure there was something that reassured them from that standpoint. And in terms of Moss and what he thinks he can be, I'm sure he does probably think he can be more than that one cut guy. He did show a little bit as a receiver last year and then in 2017 as well. But when I was writing one of the articles tonight, I said Devin Singletary can make you miss in a phone booth, and I said this guy can run through the phone booth. He 53 force or broken tackles force last year. Just a guy that he welcomes the contact, and he's going to have to be a little bit smarter about that in the NFL, because that's how the injuries get piled up if you're going to welcome those hits and things like that on a regular basis. But I also like the physicality and the fact that he's almost daring defenders to come after him.
Yeah, so a couple questions in here in the chat. Are you guys answering questions? Yes, let's open it up in this last 10 minutes for questions. And one of them I saw earlier, and is the direction that we think the Bills will go on day 3 here. 1 pick in the 4th and the 5th, 2 in the 6th, and 1 in the 7th. I do really like that cornerback position. And you mentioned Bryce Hall as a target. We've talked about him in detail in the last couple podcasts. Or specifically the last one, the Super Pod with Marcel and Joe B and John Scott. It was a great time. Go check it out where I told you earlier. But, I think that that's the kind of guy that might have dropped down a couple of rounds because of the medical red flag, but somebody that even with that kind of jump down, you have some capital on day 3. Maybe you can move up a couple spots if he falls even further, if you really like him.
Yeah, this is the time to go get Bryce Hall. I thought he was still talented enough to take the risk on him in round 3, but now that he's there on day 3 of the draft, he's a guy that I would not hesitate to trade up for and to grab, because from a talent standpoint, you're talking about a first round talent, a guy that was being talked about as a first round pick before he suffered that ankle injury. So, yeah, it obviously has pushed him down to this point in the draft, but here's where you can roll the dice if you're Buffalo. You don't have to force him onto the field as a rookie. You can go with that trio that you have with Levi Wallace, Josh Norman, EJ Gaines, and hope for the best in 2020. And then you can get him out there more in 2021. I'm not saying just, sit the guy and wrap him up in bubble wrap either, but you're not forced to kind of get him out there because of the depth that you've built for yourself in free agency.
Mm-hmm. Couple other names here that we could throw out as we move along. Obviously a linebacker that they've had contact with. That's they're kind of forming a pipeline down to Miami. Shaquille Quarterman, linebacker out of Miami. He's somebody to watch in the later rounds. Antonio Gandy Golden, I think is another one. And Ryan, you posted a story a couple days ago that the Bills have had some significant contact with him. He said he's talked to the Bills more than anybody else. How do you like that fit? Because from what I've read, he'd be one of those guys that can kind of do multiple things.
Yeah, I talked to a few people that were at the Senior Bowl that said that they thought he was just as impressive as Claypool and as I'm so tired. I'm blanking on the USC wide receiver
Pittman.
Pittman, thank you. That he was just as impressive there against that top level competition. Has the size, I think he was about a 4.6 in terms of speed, so not a blazer by any means, but can get those contested catches as well. I like him a lot. He's actually a really interesting guy, and this has nothing to really do with football, but just like all he does taught himself I don't know if he taught himself gymnastics, but the Rubik's Cube. He's teaching himself guitar. Just a really interesting prospect. One of the most one of those players that I found myself like really interested in learning about as I was going through this process. But from a talent standpoint, really good get in the 4th round. He was a guy that I thought could have come off the board in round 3 as well, especially when you started to see some of the wide receivers that were coming off the board. Colin Johnson, I believe is his name, out of Texas. He's another guy that might kind of check the boxes. So there's options there at wide receiver too, if they want to go that route. Later on, not a big wide receiver by any means, but Lawrence Cager from Georgia is a guy that they've done some homework on. So there's options there at that position. Quarterman, I like that you mentioned him. He's a thumper. He's a guy that I could see coming in and contributing immediately on special teams as well. There's still the offensive tackle Cameron Clark out of Charlotte that I really like. I think he could get pushed up as well. I was thinking 5th round for him, but I could see him coming off the board in round 4 as well.
We are a show built for the people and run by the people, and they're talking about Trent Murphy. The people are talking about Trent Murphy in the comments right now, so we better hit this before we get out of here. And I think it's very interesting because Brandon was asked about it on the conference call about specifically by Joe Buscaglia what this means for Trent Murphy and if they're going to allow or kind of look for him to maybe catch on with another team, kind of implying that they would cut him, save to $8 million. And Brandon stuck to his guns and said, hey, we're all about competition here. AJ's going to come in here and compete. But the idea right now is to bring Murphy to camp and let him compete for a job. I think that there's a scenario that could play out. And as we get close, I mean, listen, we're so far away from football right now. It feels like it's hard to envision what everything's going to look like and get ourselves in that frame of mind. But I think that once we get to that point, somebody that might be more in danger is Daryl Johnson Jr., who had a really nice rookie season for a 7th round pick. But now you add Epenesa, and depending on what happens with Murphy, he's still a guy that you can count on, in a playoff game. He came and produced against Houston, and you tend not to want to throw those guys away or move on from those guys because there's injuries. Jerry Hughes and Mario Addison are both in their 30s, as is Trent Murphy. But with that kind of older group, you're gonna want probably bodies to throw at this thing. as you move and kind of go through the season. And who's to know what the level of readiness AJ Epenesa has to transition to the NFL game. We talked to Ed Oliver numerous times last year where he basically was like, listen, I thought I was some hot shot. I was coming in here and I dominated Houston, and I thought I was going to come to the league and dominate because, I'm just naturally good and gifted and athletic. And he got here and realized, hey, I need to be fundamentally sound. Technique is no joke. I mean, it's a game of inches. I can't tell you how many times he told me that this year. And so I think Epenesa, there could be a learning curve there.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And Darrell Johnson's going to be an intriguing player to watch. I'm glad you mentioned his name because he really did flash sometimes last summer, where he really impressed a lot of the media members. He was a lot more polished than I think some of us realized, because at 7th round you thought, okay, raw prospect. Now we'll see if he takes that next step, but he has to perform well with whatever shortened off season we end up having here, because he won't be handed a roster spot. You're right. But if he performs well enough to show, all right, he's improved from his rookie season, we're still seeing those flashes, I think they would lean towards him over Trent Murphy, because Murphy's entering his final year. He's over 30. While he did step up in the playoff game and in that season finale against the Jets, it's still, this is a team that wants to have talented players that are being paid low wages, whatever. And he's on a rookie contract right now. So, they might lean that way as long as he shows that he is taking that next step from year 1 to year 2. So Mike Love could be in danger. There's a guy that's on the roster as well. So it's going to be interesting, but you're right. We don't know where Epenesa is going to be in terms of his development, if he's going to be ready to contribute in a big way as a rookie. But Murphy's seat is definitely hot right now.
All right, guys. It is 1:30 a.m. Eastern time. We were going to be back at it tomorrow. What time does the draft start tomorrow? Noon Eastern time. We will get back after it. We'll have so much content over at the site. We got a bunch right now, and I'll be writing into the wee hours of the morning, and we'll be back tomorrow. This has been the Buffalo Bills Talk with Matt Parrino podcast live version. We're going to get this on all the platforms very shortly. So subscribe, rate, leave reviews on all the different platforms. It really helps us out. My man, go get some sleep.
Yeah, we'll do. I enjoyed Bills Talk after dark.
Yes, there it is. I love it. All right, guys, have a great night, and we will be back tomorrow to wrap this thing all up. 3 days. It's been fun so far. Quarantine life has been very interesting. I don't know about you. I mean, you're dealing with your cat there. I have the kids here, so it's been a fun time. But yeah, it's been great. Have a great night, everybody, and thank you for tuning in.